frameworks.
ESG is an acronym for environmental, social, and governance, and provides a holistic approach to how organizations manage related risks and opportunities. Initially driven by the investment community to understand the non-financial impacts of investments, other stakeholders, such as consumers, customers, employees, regulators, suppliers, and communities, are placing a growing value on organizations' ESG commitments and performance. New and evolving reporting frameworks, as well as rating agencies, have emerged to guide reporting of ESG information, often called ESG disclosure, and inform stakeholders. However, organizations, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, typically struggle to navigate this web, particularly the extent and substance of information to report, and as such, disclosure is inconsistent and lacks transparency.
MyESG Star Plus is a structured ESG coaching platform that provides businesses with tailored and support to gradually adopt and integrate ESG into their operating philosophy through 9 proprietary stages, progressing the businesses to becoming ESG aligned. The platform consists of 3 tiers: gold, silver, and bronze, with each tier comprising 3 sub-tiers, identified by the number of stars assigned to each sub-tier. Businesses attaining any sub-tier of MyESG Star Plus will be awarded a star and disclosure badge if the progress is publicly disclosed. MyESG Star Plus is based on the premise that becoming ESG aligned is a journey and guides businesses in a structured, phased manner to progress through the tiers. It provides a platform to transparently disclose your ESG journey, thereby facilitating better access to financing and markets. MyESG Pulse is a purpose-built ESG disclosure platform so structured to provide a guided approach in reporting against typical ESG themes, which in turn supports internal capacity building, as well as consistency of disclosure between organizations. Not only does the platform integrate local, state, and sector-specific considerations, a benchmarking component allows comparison between organizations from similar sectors. The platform design also provides insight into progress over disclosure periods, thereby providing stakeholders with insight into an organization's ESG maturity over time. The ESG metrics will be updated periodically, keeping pace with developments in global disclosure frameworks.
ESG is an acronym for environmental, social, and governance, and provides a holistic approach to how organizations manage related risks and opportunities. Initially driven by the investment community to understand the non-financial impacts of investments, other stakeholders, such as consumers, customers, employees, regulators, suppliers, and communities, are placing a growing value on organizations' ESG commitments and performance. New and evolving reporting frameworks, as well as rating agencies, have emerged to guide reporting of ESG information, often called ESG disclosure, and inform stakeholders. However, organizations, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, typically struggle to navigate this web, particularly the extent and substance of information to report, and as such, disclosure is inconsistent and lacks transparency.
MyESG Star Plus is a structured ESG coaching platform that provides businesses with tailored instruction and support to gradually adopt and integrate ESG into their operating philosophy through 9 proprietary stages, progressing the businesses to becoming ESG aligned. The platform consists of 3 tiers: gold, silver, and bronze, with each tier comprising 3 sub-tiers, identified by the number of stars assigned to each sub-tier. Businesses attaining any sub-tier of MyESG Star Plus will be awarded a star and disclosure badge if the progress is publicly disclosed. MyESG Star Plus is based on the premise that becoming ESG aligned is a journey and guides businesses in a structured, phased manner to progress through the tiers. It provides a platform to transparently disclose your ESG journey, thereby facilitating better access to financing and markets. MyESG Pulse is a purpose-built ESG disclosure platform so structured to provide a guided approach in reporting against typical ESG themes, which in turn supports internal capacity building, as well as consistency of disclosure between organizations. Not only does the platform integrate local, state, and sector-specific considerations, a benchmarking component allows comparison between organizations from similar sectors. The platform design also provides insight into progress over disclosure periods, thereby providing stakeholders with insight into an organization's ESG maturity over time. The ESG metrics will be updated periodically, keeping pace with developments in global disclosure frameworks.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our last webinar series. My name is Daryl. So we still have some more participants joining us, but before we start, I would like you to also scan the attendance QR code on our screen. So this QR code will basically again bring you to our online registrations. There are a few informations that you do need to fill in. Also do let us know if you have any problem with this QR code. So please sign in your attendance. Also, due to our previous webinar, we have some glitches and technical issue on our internet connections. Feel free to use the chat box to inform us or interact with us whether your PowerPoint or the slide is actually freezing at a certain while I'm actually presenting on another. So please feel free to use that chat box to inform us on that, and we will wait on everyone. Yeah. All right, so I'll start our webinar now. So just a short introduction. My name is Daryl, and I'm an ESG consultant with MyESG. I graduated in University Malaysia Terengganu, and I had just recently completed my doctorate in the environmental studies, focusing on the climate change and greenhouse gases assessment. So before we go into our main agenda, which is on the basics of GHG accounting, I would like to get a small interaction with those in the webinar, just to understand which sector are you actually coming from. Now, this is basically just an example list of different sectors. You can actually just let us key in the chat box and let us know where are you from. If your list is not under this list, then just let us know what sector are you actually coming from. F&B, technology. So we have a wide varieties of people coming from different sectors. Any other sectors? Quite a lot. So now we are seeing basically the food industry, the technologies, and the chemicals. Right. We are seeing at manufacturing. All right. Okay, so there's a wide varieties of group of people in this webinar. Thank you again for joining our webinar, and we hope that through this session you would understand on GHG accounting. And on that extent, also we have another kind of like a small exercise. Depending on which sector you are coming from, could you just put in like 1, 2, 3 just to let us know what is your understanding on GHG accounting, so that we understand your levels of GHG, and we will try to tailor our presentation coming on this webinar. 1, 2, intermediate, okay. Oh, someone's on 3. Christopher. Yeah, saya gementar on 3. Just in case my knowledge is not up to you. So we are seeing a lot from 1 and 2. Then how would you rate your own GHG levels as an entity? For example, is your company already starting GHG accounting or reporting, or even actually starting your collections of GHG data? Can we look into that? We have some already started with collecting data. Some is looking for some new knowledge, trying to understand how to do with GHG accounting. All right. Anyone who has completed their GHG inventory for scope 1 and scope 2? Wow, Christopher. All right. Okay, I'm getting nervous. We have some who is very well informed on GHG accounting, but let me try my best to cover all the varieties of understanding you have on GHG accounting. And hopefully, if you do have any questions or doubts, please utilize the chat box and we will try to answer from there. Okay, thank you for your participants again. So for this session on basic GHG and accounting, we hope that we will eventually give you a better idea, guiding you on where to find all these informations, what would be involved in your GHG inventory and what is not, and in terms of GHG reporting. So hopefully we will give you a better idea on how to kickstart your own inventory development. With that ahead, firstly, I will introduce you on the basis of climate change and GHG, as emissions are basically related to both of these. So what is climate change? Climate change refers to a long-term shift in temperatures and weather patterns that lasted for an extended period of time, from decades or even longer into the centuries. We are now in the millennium, so you can see climate change is actually always ongoing. So there is 2 main contributors to that. We have the natural processes and the anthropogenic processes. Here, natural processes refers to the volcanic activities, the tectonic plate movement, as well as the changes in the sun and many more. So tectonic plate movement and volcanic activities, they are quite in line together, as when there's movement, it will causes the molten rock from the earth to rise up and erupt as volcanic activity. And when there's volcanic activity, it will erupts, explosion, and it will releases a black smoke, which is basically composed of floating particles and a lot of different gases. And when this happens, it actually reflects the sun rays or the sunlight coming from the sun, coming from the space. So eventually, when this happens, we see a gradual decrease in our global temperature, whereas the gases that is actually emitted from these volcanic activities actually contribute back to the increase of atmospheric greenhouse gases. We will come to that shortly. Also, when we talk about changes in the sun intensity, it affects our Earth temperature, as when the intensity increases, the warmer our Earth surface temperature increase. However, a bigger portion of climate change is actually contributed by anthropogenic sources, which here refers to our activities, human activities that eventually releases greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So if you look at this graphic, it is basically showing a time series changes of the global temperature since the early 19th century. So you can see a gradual increase is presented by the shifting of the blue patches temperature, and moving into more yellowish and oranges, which actually represents a warmer temperature. So as we are now today in the 21st century, you can see a lot more red, orange, and yellows patches of temperature. So it is a sign that we are moving towards an increase of temperature on a global scale. And this is something not to be happy. We should be concerned about. Moving forward today, in fact, in July this year, the Earth has experienced the warmest month ever recorded, around 1.5 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial area. And this is according to a statistic and a publication by the United Nations. So since the early 1800s, human activities has been the main driver of climate change, primarily due to the beginning of the industrializations and the urbanization era. So the burning of fossil fuel like coals, oils, and gas has continued to increase ever since then. And you have probably also heard about people planning to control the global temperature by not exceeding to 1.5 degree or 2 degree compared to the pre-industrial area. But where we are now, we are actually 1.1 degree higher than the 1880s. So we are actually not very far going into 1.5 degree. So when we talk about this burning of fossil fuel, these combustions, how do they have a thing on climate change? It's basically because when there's combustion, they releases CO2 emissions, which add up to the greenhouse gases we have in the atmosphere. So you may come back to what is greenhouse gases. We always talk about greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are gases that have the property to absorb heat from the sun. So typically there is 6 main group of greenhouse gases with actually GHG Protocol adding one more group, which is the nitrogen trifluoride. But typically we talk this 6 main group. Firstly is the CO2, which is also the largest contributor in this group. We are very familiar where it's coming from. It's from our fossil fuel combustions, from our transportation sector, from our vehicles combustions. How about methane? They are basically coming from a lot of biological activities, such as the decomposition of your organic matters, the woods, your submerged trees, or maybe coming from the discharges of your humans and animals, mainly from the cows, because they have their discharge are mainly methane oriented. Then we also have nitrous oxide, followed by groups of different gases like the hydrofluorocarbons and the perfluorocarbons, which is typically the greenhouse gases we use for our refrigerant in our refrigerant unit or aircon units, and also from sulfur hexafluoride. So these gases are typically long-lived and they can remain in the atmosphere long enough to become well mixed, meaning with the amount measured becoming roughly the same all over the world, we are actually experiencing something known as the impact of greenhouse gases effect. So what is greenhouse gases effect? This effect is something like a blanket. It is something we call it as an atmospheric blanket. So you may be able to link this with the analogy of the greenhouse that people built for planting to keep the heat from dissipating and keeping the plant growth. So how it happens is as the sun radiation passes through our atmospheric layer and heats up the earth, when it comes to nighttime, this heat will dissipate and release back to the atmosphere. Now, because of this greenhouse gases blanket that we have in our atmosphere, it traps a certain heat into our atmosphere and keeping the atmosphere warm enough to be suitable for our living. So this is actually a positive effect, keeping our temperature warm, and we are living in an optimal ecosystem. Unfortunately, what happens now is because of this anthropogenic increase of greenhouse gases over the centuries, actually, this blanketing effect has thickened and more heat is actually stored, making an increase in the overall global average temperature. And that's why we hear global warming. Then what is actually the effects of this climate change? According to scientists, they have done their research. They determined that 89% of the current changes in our ecosystem is actually consistent with the changes expected due to global climate change. And how do scientists actually come up with this statement? As you can see here, it is kind of a very apparent direct proportional relationship between the increase of GHG emissions, which coincide with the rising of global temperatures, and as well as corresponding to other impacts such as the rising of seawater levels at different years. So notably, we are also observing increased melting of ice in the North and the South Poles. So in different locations, throughout the world, we are also observing different impacts. So there are places with stronger wave height. There are also other locations with prolonged drought and water crisis, and even increased frequency of forest fires, such as in Australia. If you recall back in before the COVID years, we have extreme forest fires, which is happening in our neighboring country at Australia. You might recall back the videos whereby you see the koala bears asking for water and all that. So that is part of the climate change impact that is facing by other countries as well as our country. And because of these weather pattern changes, we are seeing behavior changes in the wildlife. We may be observing locust invasion or migration due to weathers, and we may be observing depleting of marine resources as well. So what it means to us is actually when we have droughts, we have water crisis, it impacts our food. It will impact and cause food scarcity and eventually lead to hunger and poverty. So relating this impact back to what we observe in Malaysia, we are actually currently observing a higher fluctuation of the shifting of monsoon season. We are experiencing more frequent intense wave, sea level rises, and even increase in the rainfall variabilities, where it eventually led to more severe flood. So one apparent would be the severe flood that happened back in December last year in the Klang Valley. So if we compare to yesteryears, floods were very uncommon in Malaysia, especially not that frequent these coming years. So what would actually, what would happen in the next few years? What will we be expecting to be dealing with? So as we can see here, the power generation company are now transitioning to cleaner fuel alternative. There are people who are looking into renewable energy, solar panels, because these are the changes that we would be expecting in the future years, or we may actually be currently experiencing this. Another example would be in the transportation sector. The introduction of electric vehicles, where many people are actually pushing in the attempt to reduce emissions from our conventional fuel-operated vehicles. So they believe this is one of the solutions to reduce our reliance to fossil fuel. Next, we have the oil and gas sector. Now, oil and gas sector is a bit contradictory. While their exploration activities is actually a small contribution of greenhouse gases, the product that they sold to us, the fossil fuel, is eventually something that leads us to contribute more emissions. So we would expect, or we would see how they would be expecting to adapt to these changes. So these are some of the changes that will happen in the coming years, or maybe very soon. Okay, now that we have talked about climate change, greenhouse gases, so what are the activities that contribute to greenhouse gases? As you can see here over the left-hand side statistic, this is according to the global greenhouse gases emission sector by 2019. Over 70% of the greenhouse gases is actually contributed from the energy sector, coming from the power generations, your transportations, and even energy usage in the buildings. This is followed by the agriculture, forestry, and land use sector, as well as from the other sector. So comparing it with the GHG emissions by sector in Malaysia, according to the research or data published by Our World in Data. So in 2019, our electricity and heat contributed to the largest sources of greenhouse gases emissions. This is actually consistent with how the global pattern is. And also this is followed by our land use change and forestry, which is also consistent with the global scale on agriculture. So these are the main contributors that you see. So although you may see here, like just now we have an exercise, you may be coming from the, I saw there is the chemical industry, the technology sector. We also have coming from, there's one more, manufacturing sector. So although your sector is not listed here, that doesn't mean that your sector is not actually contributing to greenhouse gases. If you look back on a day-to-day basis, your operations or we are actually using electricity like we are currently doing now. We are using electricity to power up your laptops, your computers, our Wi-Fi modem in order to join this webinar. So that is how we contribute to greenhouse gases as well. Also on a daily basis, you could be traveling with your vehicles. They are also emission-emitting vehicles. So these are all the contributors to greenhouse gases. It is just that maybe from your sector and comparing to the energy sector, by percentage-wise, you are relatively lower compared to them. So in a nutshell, we are all contributing to GHG emissions. Here again, we have talked about the climate change, we have talked about greenhouse gases, we have talked about some of the activities that relate to or contribute to greenhouse gases. Here we would like to, again, ask you to recap or understand what are the activities that on your daily routine could contribute to greenhouse gases. So here's a small exercise. I would like you to again move to our chat box. You can list out what other activities that you think would contribute to climate change. Maybe charging your phone overnight, charging your laptop overnight, and any other activities that you think might be part of the contribution to climate change or greenhouse gases. We will try to address that that question you have on the Q&A sessions. Open aircon, yes, I have an aircon running now. Yes, on your data server, aircons again. Any other activities aside from aircons and energy usage? Cooking, very good, yes. Water heater, yep. While making coffee, you are using an electrical coffee maker. Lorries, yep. So basically what I see in the chat box, you have covered mainly on the electricity usage. We have cooking, maybe you are using LPG. Water heater, maybe you are cooking, you might be, for the lorry, you may be using fuel combustion. So that's right, all of these activities actually contribute to climate change. My friend is laughing. Online shopping, that is very good. Remember, when we talk about online shopping, your shopping may not contribute to that emission immediately because you are using electricity, but your shipping to your country, that would go through the distribution line of using a ferry, using airplanes, or you might have J&T, Post Laju, Ninja Van sending your parcel. Yes, that activity contribute to greenhouse gases emissions. You are right. So now that we understand all this activity, have you ever wondered how do you calculate this activity into GHG emissions? So this is the main dish on this webinar, GHG accounting. So before we go into the calculations, here is the main equations that I want to share with you. We have a straightforward, when we talk about equations, we usually say A multiplied B equal to C. What we're actually referring is A, you have activity data coming from your fuel combustions. your electricity usage, your electricity consumptions, then we will multiply with an emission factor. Emission factor here refers to a value to represent the amount of greenhouse gases released per unit of activity. They are usually supplied by your supplier. So if it's electricity, most probably coming from our main electricity utility, which is TNB. Then in certain cases, you would multiply with the global warming potential, which is GWP. GWP is usually used if your activity is emitting other gases aside from CO2. It may be emitting methane, nitrous oxide. Now, these greenhouse gases, they have different potent level of absorbing or trapping the heats. So if your activity is emitting methane gases, after you multiply with emission factor, it will give you a kg of CH4. Then you have to multiply with GWP in order to standardize or normalize a unit that we can compare. So when we use methane and multiply with GWP, we have to multiply 25 multiplications, and eventually we will get CO2 equivalent. We will come to that on the later part, but this is just to let you know what are the equations involved in understanding what your activity contributes to what emissions. So here we have two examples actually. Firstly, we look into your electricity consumptions. So for this example here, I'm showing you one electricity bill for per month, assuming I'm using 300 kilowatt of hour of electricity, which actually translates to 100 ringgit of bill. How do I do my calculations? Again, using the A multiply B equal to C. I will take 300 kilowatt per hour, multiply with the emission factor coming from TNB, or in Malaysia, we're actually using this grid emission factor, and it will eventually translate to what emission are we actually producing. So for the answer here, for each 100 ringgit, or each 300 kilowatt of electricity, we are actually contributing 270 kilogram of CO2 equivalent. Another common activity that we do in a daily basis is actually transportation, driving. Assuming you are consuming 200 ringgit of petrol every month on a basis of 2 ringgit per liter, so you are actually using 100 liter of petrol, and that actually contributes to 200 kilogram of CO2. Now, is this a lot? If you combine them on a daily basis per person per month, you are contributing to 500 kilogram of CO2 per month. How big is that? Now, imagine I'm 100 kg. You are releasing 5 of me into the atmosphere. Now, that is how significant your contribution is. So again, we have different calculators that is publicly available in the internet. Here, I'm just showing you one from UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework for Convention of Climate Change. They actually have a calculator to let you track your personal carbon footprint. So like the activity data just now, you have coming from the transportations, your home usage of acorns, your fridge, your coffee maker, shopping. Yes, the distribution line, your transportation line associated with shopping, they all contribute to your emissions. So if you're interested, you can just go into this link and understand from a personal level, what is your carbon footprint? What is your emissions? Now, understanding from where we actually emit 500 kilogram per month based on this example, the next question will be, how many trees do you need to plant in order to balance out what you have contributed? So in 2022, the global, sorry, I'm looking at the shifting of the slides. Okay, so in 2022, based on the statistic, we are actually emitting 40 gigaton of CO2 into the atmosphere. How big is gigaton? It is actually 40 billion ton of CO2 emitted just on a basis of 2022. So how many trees are needed to absorb or balance out what we have emitted? So from a reputable sources by CO2 meter, one mature tree actually can absorb 21 kilogram of CO2. So let's try to do a calculations. For each tree absorbing 21 kilogram of CO2, you need to plant 1.8 tera trees to balance off what we have. Here, it basically means 1.8 trillion trees need to be planted in order to balance what we are emitting on last year's emission level. On a world population basis, let's say we are taking the Earth have 8 billion people. So for 40 billion tons of CO2, each person actually have to plant 233 per year in order to balance out. Coming back to what we actually emit on a monthly basis, assuming that 500 kilograms of CO2 per month, when we multiply it to 12 months, it's actually we are producing 6 tons of kg of CO2 per year. So on a personal basis, you will have to plant 270 trees per year in order to balance out that 500 kilograms of CO2. So imagine this is on a personal level based on one staff or one employee. So now imagine if your operations, you may have 10 employees, you may have other activities like your lorry transporting, your energy usage. So one organization is actually emitting a lot of emissions, and that is why we need to calculate them. Now, moving forward, as part of the initiative to combat climate, you are not doing it alone, because our government is also pushing towards carbon neutrality and net zero emissions. You may have heard that Petronas and Shell is moving towards net zero 2050, but have you ever wondered they are actually different? They actually have different definitions to that. While both is actually referring to the balancing between what GHG emission you have produced and what GHG emission you have removed, the carbon neutrality actually looks into only the carbon dioxide emissions, whereas the net zero emissions is looking into other than CO2. They are also looking into methane, nitrous oxides, and other greenhouse gases. From a regulatory perspective, the carbon neutrality is not regulated by any regulators, but for the net zero emission, this is actually regulated by the Science Based Targets initiative. It is basically a guideline that scientists has come up with reduction targets for different sectors based on this scientific assessment. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this, but instead I will use a YouTube video to illustrate what we have and how do we differentiate between carbon neutralities and net zero emissions. So let's have a look at this video.
Hi, I'm Melissa Raid, Chief Sustainability Officer of Sustain Life. In this video, we're going to talk about two terms, carbon neutrality and net zero, which are often used interchangeably, but are actually very different. So that when your company sets climate targets and starts to talk about its goals and progress, you can make sure that you're utilizing the right language. So let's back up here. What do these things have in common? Both carbon neutrality and net zero have to do with balancing an emissions output from an organization or an operation. But the distinguishing factor that hinges for both of these is the use of compensated emissions, aka offsets. So carbon neutrality allows for the use of offsets. An organization could essentially measure its emissions, purchase offsets, therefore balancing the impact of its own emissions outputs, and claim carbon neutrality. It's a great way to get started and have an impact immediately, but of course doesn't actually result in any reduction from your own emissions, which is what we all need in order to maintain a habitable planet. And that's where net zero comes in. Net zero is actually governed by a real standard by the Science Based Targets Institute, and it has a couple of detailed requirements. Number one, it requires emissions reductions across scope 1, 2, and 3 at 90% across all of those. Again, you can't use offsets to balance that. You have to actually have deep reductions. So we're talking renewable energy, efficiency projects, electrification, etc. You also have to have the long and near-term targets that align with the 1.5 degree warming scenario. So again, the targets that you're setting to achieve net zero are actually in line with what we as a global community need in order to maintain a habitable planet. And if you're formally going for the net zero claim, you're going to need to get external verification for your targets and progress, because again, it's a real standard. So in short, whether you're going for carbon neutrality or net zero, make sure that you're using the right term when you talk about your progress, because you wouldn't want to be accused of greenwashing. And if you're ready to get started on your climate goals and actions today, set meaningful targets, come visit us at sustain.life. Thanks for watching.
So for organizations who are moving towards regardless which carbon neutrality or net zero. So it's very important for you to differentiate because they are specific and they have different meaning to your company when you're setting your goals. And eventually it would also represent different ambitions. So we are seeing some company putting in net zero, carbon neutral. So yes, these terms need to be well defined so that you have a more clear direction on what you are moving towards as an entity. Now, on this session, we will be looking into GHG emission accounting. So typically, if you remember on our small interactive just now, we have seen a number of you who has already start looking into GHG inventory, and even sorry, Christopher, I have to bring you in. You have even completed your Scope 1 and Scope 2. So for those who are actually starting your accounting, congratulations. For those who have not or is still struggling to understand what is GHG, so we will move into why is GHG accounting matters, why is it important? So you may be curious, while we are talking on ESG for the past few days, and today we are moving or we are switching to GHG. So first of all, GHG is part of the environmental pillars of ESG. If you recall back in the webinar, the second and third delivered by Sophia and Oliana. So under the BUSA's reporting guide, they have actually 11 common indicators, and one of it is actually emission management. And that is where GHG emissions falls under that category. So again, we look at these six statements relating to why GHG accounting is important. There could be more, but here I'm just illustrating some of the main examples. So if we look at the first point, GHG accounting is an essential tool to let you understand what your current emissions is contributing, your levels, or what is your benchmark against other peers. Eventually, it will help you to demonstrate your voluntary action. You will get recognition for that by acknowledging how much your operation is actually contributing. How would you manage them through your reduction initiative and your commitments? So nowadays, you may have heard about solar energy, people switching to renewable energies, energy efficient electric vehicles. So they are part of the puzzle into reduction opportunities. It also helps in shaping your financials and investment decision, and finally leading you to achieving your SDG goals, 13, which is climate action. The third one, when we talk about stakeholder pressure for your supply chain, well, from a business perspective, climate change, love it or not, when we have droughts, we have floods, it is actually affecting your industry, mainly in the food industry, the wood manufacturing industry. And now we understand that our emissions is actually related to global warming, climate change. Therefore, we are seeing a global transitions effort to low carbon city and product. And that's where your company might encounter pressure from your stakeholder, whether it's from your supplier, your investor, or your customer, as they are now interested in looking into what is the environmental impact for the companies they work with. So, for instance, supposing you are my raw materials supplier, and I would be asking you whether the products, raw material that I buy from you, the bricks or the equipment, do they actually have a high CO2 content? What I'm actually asking is your production actually green? Then you might also have clients who will be requesting for your GHG report in order for them to compare among their supplier. This is because in order to fulfill ESG, they need to meet their own requirement for sustainability procurement. So this is already happening in the market, primarily for those clients in the EU, because there's the CBAM regulations. So we previously have one of our participants who are in manufacturing for international. So if you are, let's say you are exporting to other country and they do have these regulations, so yes, your company or your entity could be of risk of these coming regulations. And talk about regulations, this is where we come into point number 4. So starting your GHG accounting is always better than later because these regulations and compliance are already happening among the public listed company. And for small or medium enterprise SME, you have to start in order to avoid yourself being eliminated from the market. When we talk about point 5, this is the credible GHG disclosure with verifications in your sustainability report or your annual reports. So we will be discussing about verification shortly, but it is also important to highlight under GHG, there is no certifications, there is only GHG verifications. Being verified ensures that your emission levels is reported accurate. You are meeting with requirements of any reporting framework that you may be subscribed. And it also gives you confidence on what you are reporting and it secure a green status or reputation in the markets for your future collaboration opportunities. And lastly, when we talk about key enablers into carbon offset, if you are one of the companies that eventually is looking into participating carbon offsets or trading markets, GHG accounting by structuring your key data, it helps you to, it's kind of like your critical ticket or your key enabler to enable your future participation into this market. So again, before we move into the next one, would you also share with us, for those of you who have actually started or going into GHG, what are your drivers? Are they coming from your clients that we have mentioned, or is it maybe your own voluntary action? Could we have maybe one or 2 minutes to let you let us know why are you conducting your GHG accounting? We don't see any responses yet. Compliance, voluntary, all right. So typically we see a lot coming from the compliance, although from BUSAs, they have emission management, they are looking for Scope 1, Scope 2, and minimal reporting for Scope 3, but typically it comes back to your compliance. Voluntary strategy, I will understand it as you are trying to understand what is your current company's baseline so that eventually moving forwards with ESG, you might be setting your reduction targets. So again, thank you for your participations in our short exercise because we will come to that shortly as well. So now that you understand what the market needs and why they want your GHG reporting, you should also understand that some of the data requested by your stakeholder, you may or may not already have that data. It's just that your existing or current data management structure, how you disclose them may lack effective communications. What that means is now that we have GHG accounting coming from GHG protocol, for instance, by basing to international standards and you feeding on your existing database to that basis, because it is more structured, then it will be a better communication to your public. That is what it means by your current management structure may be lacking communications. So in short, what should you move forward with GHG accounting? Firstly, you can start by monitoring, collecting, or managing all your sources of emission, all your activities that contribute to GHG, and scope them into different scopes according to international standards. So for example, you may be having fuel consumption from your lorries, from your boilers for the manufacturing company. You may be using a lot of electricity for your data server, for your fridge, for your coffee making. So these are all activity data that's scattered around and not structured. So by basing it to any standard, you would structure them into Scope 1, which will be related to direct emissions, Scope 2 looking into indirect emission, and maybe Scope 3 looking into other indirect emissions. So that is what it means by having a structured communications how would I put it, a structured communication system, so that you will eventually be able to demonstrate more in how do I put it. Let me just go on. You will shortly understand. So by having you collecting all this data, putting them into different scopes, it will eventually helps you to calculate your GHG emissions more accurately, more properly, and following standards. So eventually through day, you will try to establish your own entities or company baseline emissions. And from that baseline emissions, is then you look into your strategies, your reduction targets for your activities. And this is where, because of your baseline, you would now be able to identify what activities is actually contributing the most significant emissions in your company. And that is where you put in your reduction targets into that. And very lastly is for reporting and verification purposes. It is to demonstrate that your reported data is actually following reporting principles, as well as to showcase that you have started with GHG accounting. So when we do GHG accounting, there is two main standards. There are more, but typically in Malaysia, these are the two main standards. ISO 14064 is produced by the ISO organization, and we are typically quite familiar with ISO 14000s, ISO 19000s, sorry, 9001. And the GHG protocol is actually a set of guidelines produced by the World Business Council for Sustainability Development. Now, both of these covers very similar activities, but they are just typically categorized differently. But while GHG protocol is more widely used in Malaysia, so this is why often you hear the term scope 1, 2, and 3. Again, we'll go that shortly. Now, here is a little bit comparison on what is the two main standard. The ISO 14064, the standard is basically to help you identify what needs to be done in order for you to do your GHG accounting. While for the GHG protocol, it is more towards guiding you on how you should do it. So that's where when we come up to develop your GHG inventory, most of the time we refer to GHG protocol because they have a clear set of guidelines on what are the activity data, where can you find this activity data, what are the emission factors associated to that, and how do you do that calculation? So it's typically an encyclopedia that you can just refer to. So both standards are also well recognized and accepted. The only main differences you will see is actually in the last two rows. Primarily on the ISO 14064, they actually recommends verification process and provides a first and third-party guidance on how would you prepare your verifications. So the process of verifications typically means that you will prepare your GHG inventory and you will have a third party to verify that data so that the information provided is considered credible and can be accepted for your any purposes, let's say for carbon trading or in order to report in your annual report. And the last row is actually on greenhouse gases targets. Now the GHG protocol do recommend some targets in order to let you understand or guide you through how do you set your reduction targets from year to year. And again, we have to state this again. While we are on the topic of verifications, there is no GHG certifications, there is only GHG verifications. Oftentimes people get confused because other standards require certifications as a proof of conduct. But for GHG, in order to demonstrate that your emissions is reported accurately, typically it just requires a verifications. Another major confusions that people have when it comes to GHG protocol is because they actually have three GHG accounting. There is GHG entity accounting, project accounting, and product accounting. So there are also standards that is intended for different accounting, like there's two standards for entity, one for project and another one for protocol. How do we differentiate between all these accounting? Typically, when we talk about entity accounting, it refers to developing an inventory that combines all your emission data from all across your company's operations. So this inventory would contain information of your emissions so that it will help you to track your productions that actually had occurred, or compare with some of the prior years. For example, you're comparing it with your baseline. So for the project accounting, it refers to quantifying the future emissions reduction expected from the individual projects. For example, if you are looking into wind farms, you are looking into solar power farms or reforestation project, you would be doing project accounting. So it is used to quantify these offset projects. The third one on product accounting, it refers to combining all the emissions that come across the life cycle of that individual project. So for instance, if you look at the graphic on the right-hand side, product inventory will combine the emission coming from your product manufacturers, distribution from the upstream and the downstreams, under the reuse, and even on the recycling of that product. So to conclude, a GHG accounting is to attribute and quantify GHG emission correctly. So attribution is critical because it enables organizations to understand where this emission is actually originating from, while accurate quantifications is to ensure that the true extent of the emission is actually captured. And this is essential for you to develop an effective emission management. Then GHG accounting is also to establish verifiable process for data collection and quality management. Typically, it means establishment of the verification process need to be put in place for your data collections so that it ensures reliability and accuracy of that data. The last one is to report your GHG information as appropriate to the needs of the intended user, meaning when you do your reporting, there are some reporting principles that need to be put in place. So what are these reporting principles? Typically, whether you are using a GHG protocol or the ISO standard, that refers to these 5 principles. The first one is relevance. This is to ensure that your GHG inventory appropriately reflects the GHG emission associated to your organization or to your services. Then for completeness as well, we are accounting for or report on all the GHG emission sources and activities with the chosen inventory or from your organization boundary. Consistency is where we ensure that the methods we use for your emission calculation are consistent throughout the years, so that it allows for meaningful comparisons. Transparency is to make sure that the source of the data, information that eventually becomes your activity data, is transparent and can be tracked. So this is in order to provide a clear audit trail so that when you do your verification purposes, you are not barred for or given a bad reputation for not having a good transparency. And lastly, when we talk about accuracy, when it comes to GHG calculations, you want to make sure that your GHG activity data or your calculations is actually accurate. And when it comes to GHG protocol, they also specify a certain threshold limit where we take into consideration the limit to confirm that this data are actually acceptable or it should be excluded. Now we look into the steps and components of GHG inventory. This first page is basically to provide you an overview of how you should look into gathering your data and setting up your teams in terms of how they collect data or doing the calculation. So first of all, again, if you remember, I asked you who are your drivers. This is to understand what is your intended usage and why are you coming up with your inventory. The next step will be mapping out your organization boundaries, what entities should be included and what should not be included, or why you do not want to be included in your boundaries. The third one is to determine the coverage of your operational boundaries, looking into what are the direct and indirect emissions that you will be included in your reporting. And lastly is to set up an internal team to work on this data and calculations. So when you are intending to come up with your GHG inventory, firstly, you need to identify who are your intended user. Are you preparing it for your client, or is it for your own organization purposes for voluntary baseline establishment? Or are you actually subscribed to any GHG program? Or maybe in the near future, you may be anticipating new regulations that would require you to report. Or maybe it is required by the financial institution, and that's where when you're trying to get some financial facilities, they will require you to provide your GHG reporting or your inventory, or maybe other stakeholder, because your facility may be located in a location where they look into if your operation is green or not. You might have local community or the NGO coming to ask for your GHG reporting on your operations. The next one is to find out the intended usage of, or we say the purpose of this GHG inventory. So what is the main purpose of your organization to quantify emission and removals, whether to set your targets, or is there any existing program driving this reporting? What would the eventual decision come out from you having this GHG inventory? And what is the desired outcome of sharing this data to your intended user? Secondly, you will need to map your organization boundaries. Now, this can be quite straightforward if you only have a parent company and you have one or few facilities. So it is very straightforward because they are all part of your operations. In another case where you might have multiple facilities or businesses, for example, in this graphic, you are showing you may be a parent company, but you have business A that is fully operated by you, whereas your business B or C may be operated by your partners, or it could be a joint venture. Then this would add to the complexity when it comes to GHG reporting. So under the GHG protocol, there is actually two consolidation approach. Typically, the most widely used would be the operational control, whereby you will only consider or include those operation, business, facilities that you have full control. And when you take this approach, you will take 100% of the emissions that is contributed by this entity that you have included. Alternatively, if the percentage of ownership or the economic interest is more of your concern, then, for example, you may be concerned about the number of shares you have in your subsidiary companies, then using the equity share approach could be more relevant to your intentions. That's why it relates back to your intention of delivering this GHG inventory. Third one, we look into the activities or the operation boundaries that is part of your operations. So the idea here would be to determine which emission sources to be included. So if you remember that we have discussed about the different scope 1, 2, and 3. So typically when we talk about scope 1, it refers to all the types of activity that releases emissions from your direct operational processes. So those that are being owned by you, for example, your vehicles, or from your productions of your products. The scope 2 refers to the indirect emission, typically covers the consumed electricity or from your cooling and heating that you use in your facilities. And because you are purchasing this source of energy, you have to include that in your boundary as part of GHG inventory. Scope 3 refers to all the emissions not under your direct control or not owned by you, but they are typically along your supply chain, so they can be coming from your upstream or your downstream. Hence, at this stage is where companies would determine how would they categorize their emission into different scope 1, 2, and 3. And this is also the part where, because of this structuring, it makes it clear which scope of emission sources you intend to manage and reduce. And it also sets a clear direction to everyone reading your report. So it doesn't mean that your existing data management could be obsolete or not contributing anything, but because on the international side, we are basing on GHG protocol or scope 1 to 3, having this structured or categorizing your emissions would deliver a better message or clear message to your audience. So here is we go deep down into direct emissions, Scope 1. Firstly, Scope 1 is a required or mandatory reporting for GHG inventory. And it is categorized into these four major categories: the stationary, mobile, process, and emissions. When we talk about stationary combustions, we look into your fuel combustions or your we mainly look into the fuel combustions in your facilities. So let's say from a power generation industry, you could be using boilers to generate steam in order to turn the turbines. Maybe you are in the waste treatment industry. You could be using burners, heaters, or incinerators to decompose your waste. So all of these fuel combustions comes into your stationary combustions. On the other hand, we have mobile combustion, which is quite straightforward. Any fuel that is used for you to power your vehicles, your forklift, maybe if you are a big company, you have your own jets, you have your own ships, those fuel that comes into that vehicles or that transportation comes into your mobile combustions. Process emissions is related back to maybe chemical factory, whereby you have processes that releases CO2 emissions or other greenhouse gases. So typically we look into, let's say you're a cement company, you have calcination processes, or you could be from a burning factory or facilities, you have catalytic cracking. So these are the processes that is categorized under process emissions. Lastly, fugitive emissions. I guess most of you is quite, I would say, is more into this because, as I mentioned, what activity is actually contributing to greenhouse gases. A lot of you say aircons, refrigerator. Yes, aircon is using electricity, but again, what powers the refrigerant or the cooling effect is when we put in this refrigerant. Refrigerant is a part of GHG. They are part of the hydrofluoro or the perfluorocarbon. So we look into these refrigerant leaks from your joints, your gasket. So this falls under the fugitive emissions. I hope I don't confuse you with all these categories. And then we look into, like, we have a lot of these participants who are coming from the electricity or coming from the technology sector. You may be using a lot of your activities by consuming electricity. So this is also one of the mandatory scope that you need to report in your GHG. So if you look on the right hand side of this figure, we are basically just letting you know that because most of our participants is not coming from the power generation sector, this is not your scope 1. But for us who are consuming electricity from TNB, this is why it falls under the scope 2 on consumed electricity. Scope 3, this is not mandatory, but according to Bursa Malaysia, if you are a private listed company, they now require you to by minimum report your business travel and employee commute. So we will get into Scope 3 now. Scope 3 covers 15 categories covering the upstream and downstream. So for those of you who might have joined our previous webinar, if you recall from Mr. Lee Lian Beng, one of our colleagues, he always mentioned that Scope 3 is like a monster because they cover 15 categories instead of just 1 or 2 categories. So the upstream emissions is the indirect GHG emissions that is related to your purchase or acquired goods and services, which covers from your manufacturers, from your suppliers, and whereas the downstream emissions is actually the indirect GHG emission related to goods or services that has been sold by you as the reporting company. So while not officially mentioned by the GHG protocol, we can kind of classify the upstream waste generation, the business travel, and the employee commute to be under the operation control. This is because as an entity, you can actually choose to, you can have a selection on how would you travel for business travel. For example, from KL to Malacca, you can choose airplanes, or you can choose using public transport, or you can even choose by driving a car. So you do have a certain operational control on that category, which is why again, we see why BUSA is coming into your minimum reporting should be coming into business travel and employee commute. For the waste generation, as a company, you have generate waste, and you can actually choose your own waste treatment provider, to the extent that you can appoint them to request a certain portion should go into landfill, a certain portion should go into incinerator, as well as into recycling. So you also have an extent of operational level to decide how would you want your waste to be disposed. Again, the confusion about scope 1, 2, 3 is we often hear about my scope 1, 2, 3 is your scope 3, or your scope 1, 2, 3 is my your scope 1, 2 is my scope 3. So while this statement is fundamentally correct, it should not be generalized. Here we show that category 1 and 3 is basically covering the emissions from the life cycle of the raw product. So we're not looking into that. Instead, we will look into the rest of the other categories. So you can see here, all these categories activity data are also coming from their scope 1 and 2. That is why, to a certain extent, your scope 1, 2 is my scope 3 is correct, but it should not be generalized. Imagine your waste management provider's scope 1 would be their fuel and combustion emissions for them to travel to your company and collect your waste on a weekly basis. But your waste treatment provider could have been providing services to company B and C as well. So here is where an allocation method need to be put in place. Without it, you would be mistakenly taking up more scope 3 emissions, meaning you could be taking up emissions from company B and C. So that is why it is important to take up only the allocated scope 1 and 2 emissions from your scope 3 supplier. So we hope we make this clear enough so that you would be more cautious, and it can help you to account your emission more accurately. Also, not forgetting, when you are conducting or developing your GHG accounting, it requires a best year to be chosen. It is relatively very important for several reasons, but the most important would be to serve as a reference point or the baseline to demonstrate meaningful comparison of emission data over time and setting your targets. So typically the selection will look into the earliest year with verifiable emission data for required scopes. So example, if you look at these 3 years, so out of these 3 years, the company has started collecting your data, but a more suitable best year would be the year 2021, because on this year you have actually your scope 1 and scope 2 data already inventoried. So once your boundary is set, you will look into gathering data and start your GHG calculations. So as I mentioned previously, this is the calculation equation that we use. Activity data multiplied with the emission factor. Certain cases you need to multiply with the GWP. So just a short recap. Activity data refers to your petrol consumption, your fuel consumptions, and even your electricity consumptions. Emission factor is the value that represents the conversion from activity data to the emissions. And GWP is where we look into if your emissions is coming from other greenhouse gases such as methane and nitrous oxide. Now, the next question would be, how do you find all this activity data and who would be holding all this data? This is where we look into your internal team. Now, bear in mind that just like a typical environmental health and safety initiative, this is not an effort of a team of 2 or 3. In fact, it involves the whole company. So in order to gather all of your activity data, it actually involves your operational personnel. So information related to cooling system or how much CO2 is emitted from the combustion system in your production line, or any chemical reaction in your production lines. Your operation personnel is the one who keeps all these informations and will be able to provide you with all this data. Then you also have from the financial or your procurement HR department, they are actually holding your utility bills for electricity, or maybe if in the near future you are looking into green procurements, they are the one who would understand the guideline requirement and assist you to providing the required information into green procurement. Also, your HR would keep track of your employee data. So when you are looking for activity data to fit into your scope 3 categories for business travel and employee commute, in terms of what is the flight information, your expenses claim, mileage travel, your fuel consumption, so the HR would be the person to provide you all these informations. Of course, this initiative needs to be led by a GSG program lead. So the GSG program lead will look into how to collect the data, what is a suitable calculation methods, how to well manage the inventory, how to set up reduction strategies, or even how to bridge the collaboration between different departments to facilitate the data management and convey intention. They are also the one who would be providing trainings to your stakeholders or different staff within the organizations. So typically they are the one who is taking the lead on GSG development. Of course, it is also important to have the support from the senior leadership. So similar to an EHF initiative, the commitment should come from the senior management. It's typically important to drive the whole direction. In this session, we will be looking at the inventory reporting. What are the information that should be reported and what are the information that may be reported on an optional basis? So at certain times, while we have GSG protocol guiding you on what is required and optional, at certain times you may be required to tailor what you have to report according to your requirement from your intended user. Maybe you are subscribing to BUSA or GRI, you have voluntary registry who require you to report certain information. This is where you need to rely on them instead of the GSG protocol. But on a basic level, the GSG inventory contains these two main informations. Under the required reporting, so it includes certain things that need to be reported. So typically, a company would have to describe the business unit that are included in this inventory and whether they are using the equity share approach or one of the consolidation approach from the financial or the operational control. And again, the company would also have to provide an outline on what are the operational boundary used, what are the sources of emission included, and if there is any scope 3 included, then they have to specify what types of activities or categories are being covered. And lastly, of course, the inventory requires you to report your reporting period, whether you are from the 1st January to 31st of December as your financial year FY 2022, or maybe you have different reporting periods starting from March or from June. This has to be disclosed in your reporting. The inventory, of course, also has to contain your total scope 1 and 2 emission, independence of any GSG threats such as offsets or allowances. So it must report your raw scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. The emissions should also be reported separately between scope, meaning you have a scope 1 emissions coming from different categories. You need to separate them, and even for scope 2 and to the extent of scope 3. And if you have any emissions that is aside from these 7 GSG, like the CO2, the methane, you also have to report them. So typically when we report this GSG, you can report it as, let's say in the example, 100 ton of methane, or you can also report it as 2,100 ton of CO2 equivalent after multiplying with the GWP. Also, if you have CO2 emission that is coming from the biomass, they must be separately disclosed. You should also report what is your base year and eventually what is the emission profile over the time. To the extent if your companies have set up different conditions for base year recalculations, these need to disclose in the reporting. One important part is companies need to report on the methodology used to calculate or measure these emissions. They should provide a reference or link to any calculation tools that is used. So this piece of information is quite important component F. The inventory would provide the user the sense of level of accuracy of the calculations. And lastly, they should report any specific exclusion or sources, facilities, or operation that is not included in their boundary. On the optional, there is a wide variety of data that the company might want to include in their reporting. So if Scope 3 is included in your operational boundary, then company should list out the emissions data that is relevant to that Scope 3. Just now I did mention as well, if your emission is not from the GHG protocol, you could have emissions coming from non-Kyoto. For example, in the food industry, you may be using methyl bromide for fumigation purposes. You can also put in this in your report. If you have different facilities, you have 1, 2, 3 facilities across different countries, you can report this emission by subdividing all these facilities to make it more transparent. Also, instead of just reporting your emission in Scope 1, 2, 3, certain companies do rely on this performance benchmarking data, or they will rely on racial performance indicator to demonstrate their emissions, whether it's in the sense of CO2 emissions per revenue or CO2 emissions per tons of material. Another information that is quite important is the outline of the GHG management programs. So if your company is undertaking any of this program, it is an important element to be stated out in your inventory so that for your audience or the public to be reading your report, they are understanding your efforts is putting into these programs. And lastly, on verification purposes, if you have did your verification, then you could optionally report it at your reports, as well as the emissions over the years, or you can also choose just to report on a mandatory basis, your best year and your reporting year. So while I go through all of this, it will be better if I show you some examples of this emission report. So over here is a sustainability report from Bursa. And I will go through you one by one on what is required and what is optional. So the required will be listed in a red line or red box, whereas the optional will be a blue box. So when we talk about the required reporting, which is the organization boundary and what approaches are you using. So if you can see here, the Bursa Malaysia is actually using the financial consolidation approach. Then they are actually covering Scope 1, 2, 3, and they list out what are the Scope 1 categories that they are currently inventory or using as part of their boundaries. Then we look at their best years. They did mention their best years actually referring to when, and their reporting years emission. So this is to enable audience to see the performance of their emissions over the years. One part that I mentioned is important is to understand what calculation methodologies you are using. So for Bursa Malaysia, they are actually using this GHG protocol. And if you are excluding any facilities from your boundary, then you need to report it in your report. It needs to be disclosed with a justification by your company. So on the optional, because you are reporting Scope 3, it is on an optional reporting. You can state out what sources or what categories of Scope 3 are you actually reporting. And lastly, on verification, if you have done your verifications, you can disclose that information in your reporting, saying that which inventory or which financial GHG emission has actually been verified by a third party, and who are these third party, and what are their opinions on your emissions. Another report, we look into the TNB's reports. So also the organization boundary, they are using the equity share approach. Then they are they are subscribed to GRI, and that is why they are reporting their emissions, GHG emissions, under the emission management. So you can see here they are just reporting scope 1 and 2 because scope 3 is optional. The emissions are tracked by years. This is the emission profile. Then the calculation tools, they're actually using the IPCC guidelines instead of the commonly used the GHG protocol. And on the optional, they are also providing their verification statement. So on verification, again, we have to emphasize enough that GHG, there is no certifications. There is only verification process. A verification process involves the assessment of the risk of material discrepancy of a reported data. Discrepancy here relates to the differences between the reported data and the data generated from proper applications of relevant standards and methodologies. Basically, what it means here is it compares the data that you report against doing a proper calculation estimations. So the process, it is also a process for evaluating a statement of historical data to determine if your statement, the one that you report, is actually materially correct and conforms to the criteria. What it means here is for certain criteria for your GHG reporting, you can use verification to make sure that the data you report conforms to this criteria. And GHG verification can be done by third-party auditor as well as from an internal expert, meaning that if you are not looking for third-party auditor, you can actually do a internal audit to confirm or verify your GHG emission data before going towards a third-party auditor. So why are we doing verification? The main thing is to provide confidence on the reported data or information or statement. As we mentioned here, the data reported should have no discrepancy and should conform to criteria. Another main reason for doing verification, in most cases we meet, is to meet with requirements. So if you are reporting and it requires you to fulfill a legal requirement, and the verification is part of that requirement requested by your regulator, then you would have to do so. That is by meeting the requirement of the regulator. The secondly would be to increase your management and board confidence on the reported data. And lastly, to add credibility, especially if you're reporting to certain stakeholders for the data from your organizations. Now we are actually at 1:30. I have a few more slides. Mainly, they are not really related to GHG protocol, but this is more towards an additional tips on how you can develop your inventory, as well as some of the tips and tricks. So once you have collected your activity data, you would think of how would you calculate your emission data and how would you eventually roll up your corporate. So there are actually two different approaches here by the GHG protocol, which is a centralized and decentralized. Either your organization operation personnel themselves can do the calculations and pass them to your corporate, or your corporate will be doing that calculation themselves. But there are pros and cons associated with this. So under the centralized approach, it means that your individual facilities or your operation personnel will report this activity data to the corporate level, and you have maybe another team who will be doing that calculations. So the pros is that it is suitable for office space, and because the calculation is quite straightforward, so there is no issue over here. On the other hand, on the decentralized approach is whereby your operation personnel will collect the activity data and they will do that calculation themselves and eventually reporting it to the corporate level. The pros here is that your operation personnel will be aware of the activity data, how to do that calculation. They will understand why is the activity data important. So a certain confidence level is built from there. But the cons is that your operation personnel would require more training. And on top of that, maybe you have operation personnel A doing that report for month A and operational personnel B doing that report for month B. So there is a potential of calculation errors. So these are some of the approaches a corporate level can take, but you should also be aware of the pros and cons. Challenges in your activity data. The most common challenges that we find throughout our services for GHG among our clients is that a lot of this information are not structured down or is not given to the next in line, meaning a lot of this information are not filed in as a digital information. A lot of actually still in the hard copy format. So during a company restructure, this information tends to go missing or it was not handed down to the next in line. So this is mainly highlighted to your ACONs as well as your diesel storage tank, as ACON typically we install for 10 to 20 years, and the diesel storage tank, if it's not used, typically it is dormant at the site. So after 5 or 10 years, this data information may no longer be available in your corporate, or to a certain extent, the leveling on this equipment may be gone because of the wear and tear. So when we go into these challenges, on the stationary and mobile combustion, so like I mentioned, because this information is no longer available, you might not have the tank specifications, and to a certain extent, we notice that because this diesel tank is used for the purpose of emergency electricity backup, so you might not be frequently using it, or you might not do maintenance to that. So to a certain extent, your on-site metering may have faulty, or it may not track the actual inventory you have for the fuel storage you have. The third one is actually on determining if your device is stationary or mobile. So with the advancement of technology, our previous lawnmower has advanced to a vehicle that we can drive on. So if you have a big farm and your lawnmower is actually kind of like a forklift, it can move on itself, it actually falls under the mobile combustions. Whereas if typically you are still using the conventional lawnmower where you are moving that trimming equipment you're on, then that equipment falls under the stationary equipment. From a mobile perspective, if you have a fleet of vehicles for distributions, for transportations, there are certain cases whereby not all your vehicles is actually inventory, meaning you might have a few vehicles that has been sent for maintenance. So we noticed that you should have an inventory or a remark mentioning that these vehicles for this reporting period is sent for maintenance and they are not included in this scope. Another thing would be for fuel combustion or stationary combustion, we look into the fuel combustions. There are also different methods to track by mileage, but the challenges here is that the mileage track may not fully reflect the actual fuel combustion. Imagine if you have a board of directors and typically they have drivers. So when they go for meetings, the drivers would be waiting at the porch and they would be using ACON, and ACON is part of the combustions of fuel. So to a certain extent, mileage may not be more accurate. So these are some of the challenges that we find in stationary and mobile combustions. On the fugitive, like I mentioned, is on the information base, because your ACON could be 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So the information may no longer be available. Let's say you may no longer have the information of when this ACON is actually installed, what is the capacity of the refrigerant, and who are the contractors. So without this information, it will be difficult for the GHG program lead to set up their new reduction targets. So if they are moving towards energy efficiency or they are moving towards renewable energy, without understanding of which ACON unit to be retired or to be upgraded into a new or a better Energy Star rating, so it will become a difficulty in this section. So this is one of the challenges. Another challenges we see is when we talk about refrigerant or ACON, we look into the refrigerant. So in our Malaysia practice, a lot of this refrigerant is actually charged by a cylinder. So when the pressure is low, you will ask for contractor to do maintenance and fill up the gases. So, but for calculation purposes, we actually need the weight the mass of the refrigerant. So it becomes a difficulty in order to understand the weight of refrigerant for your recharge of that unit. Secondly, for purchase electricity, although it's very straightforward, but we do have challenges whereby your company is only taking into account the cost of electricity bill by your financial department, but the activity data we require here is actually the electricity consumptions. So in certain cases, you might have to put in assumption to that. Then to a certain extent, because you haven't started with doing this data collection, you might have difficulty whereby there is missing data for a few months. Or if you are in a shared building, for example, this building is shared between your leaser or you have tenants. So in certain cases, when you are trying to just calculating what electricity consumption is consumed by your operations, without that separate electricity meter, it will present another challenges to you. In certain cases, if you are not the landlord of that facility or that building, where you are just renting from another landlord, sometimes they do not have that separate meter for you as well, and that electricity consumption is actually embedded as in the renter as a total. So again, it makes a difficulty in you to obtain your activity data, which is your electricity consumptions. In certain cases where you have that building and you might be renting out for event purposes and they are just using the fan, the aircons, or any type of electrical appliances, in order to remove them from your total electricity consumptions, you might need to put in separate meter for each electrical consumption, electrical appliances, in order to accurately track what is your actual electricity consumption. So these are some of the challenges that we have met along the services we provide. And the last part is actually on calculation approach. So when we talk about getting all these activity data, the GHG protocol actually have a hierarchy of calculation approach. So if you can see here, the direct measurements, stoichiometry and calculation, site-specific estimate emission, they can all provide you activity data for you to calculate the GHG emissions. However, the level of accuracy is different by having a direct measurement. For example, if you are installing a continuous monitoring system to your source of emissions, then the level of accuracy will definitely be higher. But to that extent, because you are installing that equipment, you will have to put in a lot more capital investment. So this is how it weighs out between the pro and the cons. So typically, we would be relying on the fourth method, the fourth approach, which is by estimating the emission, by taking up what is your fuel consumptions and multiplying with an appropriate emission factor. So the examples of these direct measurement would be the measuring units. So there is a lot of this analyzer that is available in the market. Some are expensive, some could be not so expensive, but here we are basically just looking at installing that unit, for example, at your facility stock, maybe at your boiler exhaust, or maybe at your vehicle exhaust, to understand as respect to time, what is the flow or what is the concentration emitted over that time. So this is how we get the direct activity data through direct measurement. For stoichiometric calculations, if you are maybe in the chemical industry or chemical facilities, you are actually combusting certain hydrocarbons. So you would be doing your like, for example, you will be putting 1 mole of methane or 1 mole of ethane is actually produced, saying how many moles of CO2. So this is how you calculate based on this mass balance approach in order to find out your activity data from that processes. The third one is actually site-specific. So how do we come up with emission factor? For example, in the left-hand side, let's assume that TNB is our energy utility provider. And for a certain generation, let's say for one 100,000 generation of for 100,000 megawatt hour of electricity generated by TNB, they are actually emitting, let's say, 60 tons of CO2 equivalent, and that's how they divide and we get the emission factor from that. So in certain cases, you might have your equipment manufacturer already providing what is the spec of that equipment, and you can use that spec to estimate what is the emission coming from the usage of that equipment. And lastly, the most commonly would be estimating the emissions. We will be taking activity data from your fuel purchasing invoices or your receipts. In certain cases whereby you don't have your electrical appliances specification, what voltage is it, you can also refer to calculators from the public available internet, or maybe you can rely on TNB. They have these home calculators where you can put in your appliances and they can calculate that wattage for you. So we mentioned a lot about these calculations. In the GHG protocol, they actually have calculator tools that is applied across sector. So on the cross-sector calculators, they have one for stationary combustion, mobile combustion, as well as for refrigerant. However, they also have site-specific for sector-specific. However, these GHG protocol are quite outdated, which is why we'd like to take this opportunity to also introduce what we have. MyESG has also developed our own in-house tool, and it will facilitate easier calculations of your overall activities. And we are regularly updating the emission factor using Malaysia's, using from TNBs, from the grid emission factors, or maybe if there is none from the Malaysia community, we will rely on the US or the UK. So another thing we will highlight is our tool can be tailored and customized to your operation purposes, meaning if you have different activity data, we can customize it to your own need and for your own usage. So that basically wrap up our webinar for this series. So we move to questions. Is there any question on the board that we haven't addressed? Oh, a lot of questions. Let's try to go through them. So I believe some of these questions, Mr. Lee Dian Beng, my colleague, has already addressed, but let me just bring it out. So we have a first question in the Q&A box from Capitan. How do we know when to account just for CO2? Or do we need to include other GHGs such as methane, nitrous oxide, and the sulfur dioxide? So our response was, I believe unless you are on a certain specific reporting requirement, one should just calculate CO2 equivalent emissions, which covers all the GHG groups. Then, meaning we shall just refer to emission factor that covers CO2 equivalent will do. This is coming from Capitan. So our responses is that typically the references will give you the emission factor of CO2 equivalent, or maybe in the sense of GHG or nitrous oxide. But eventually, when we do our reporting, we will just take the emissions that is in different GHG, methane or nitrous oxide. We'll just multiply with the GWP eventually to report it in CO2 equivalent. Because again, CO2 equivalent is a normalized unit that we use for GHG reporting. Moving on to the next question from Huang Xingyi. How do we know how many kilos of CO2 are released for each activity, like burning of petrol? Is there a standard that we can rely to? So our responses is there are many ways to calculate that, but typically it is calculated using the emission factor. So yes, I have touched on that. So emission factor refers to the value that represents your activity data converted into emissions. So when you have the activity data in kg or kilowatt per hour, after you multiply with the emission factor, you will get a final result or final data as emissions. So that's how you calculate. By Huang Xingyi again, we are a company that operates 100% remotely. All our staff is working from home. So does the electricity used by our staff at home fall under our company's GHG scope of emissions? That's a very good question. If yes, how do we quantify this? Our responses is that the type of emissions is under scope 3. So people will calculate it under employee commute category. So you can estimate the electricity usage based on the type of equipment used. So for example, you are just for your home base, you may be opening, switching on just one light, one aircon, just using one computer for 8 hours. So you will typically get that wattage of wattage from the electrical appliances and multiply it with the emission factor coming from electricity, and that comes into your scope 3 employee commute. We have from Capitan, what are the common issues related to refrigerant emission faced by others? For us who engage with local small vendors to service aircon and refill refrigerant, we were told that it is not possible to quantify the refrigerant. How should we navigate around this? Yes, we do face this issue as well. We have clients who requested that contractor to weigh the refrigerant cylinder before and after refilling the gas in order to quantify what is the kg of refrigerant refill. So like I mentioned just now, one of the challenges, yes, we do face this. So typically what we suggest is to weigh the cylinder before and after. Again, from Huang Xingyi, regarding scope 3 allocation, how do we decide what percentage of emission to allocate for our service between provider and our company? The answer is on a case-by-case basis. For example, if your supplier produces one product and sell you 60% of the product, you may probably use the 60% as the allocations. Again, from Capitan, in such cases, it could be that there are still double counting in terms of scope 3 if supplier isn't able to provide the allocations. There is no answer to that. So yes, in certain cases, we understand that your supplier may not started their GHG inventory yet. So this is why when we talk about scope 3, it is not mandatory, it is still optional. And for each assumption that you put into each categories, you do have to disclose that into your reporting period, your reporting documents. And this is why, again, scope 3 is your scope 3 emission will basically be quite fluctuating. You may have different assumption over the years, but still with the assumption that you have met, it will provide at least understandable scope 3 emission from your entity or your company. Capitan again. Yearly external fumigation, scope 3, and weekly internal fogging, scope 1. Are the scopes selected correct? Our answer is external means done by contractor side. If yes, then it is under scope 3. Done on site, scope 1 will be more appropriate. So yeah, that answer the questions. From Christopher, I'm worried about this person. He has completed his scope 1, scope 2. So recommendations on monitoring and verifying upstream and downstream scope 3 emission from supply chain. Recommendation, you're asking for recommendations. Frequent expansion makes it difficult to stick to one baseline. True. Manual key-in accounting versus enterprise level carbon management assistant, for example, Alibaba Cloud Carbon Visions. So our answer is, for your first questions, you have to have an engagement with them to go through their data in order to get a third-party verifier. Okay, so for the second questions, baseline and base year is fixed unless there is an acquisition or diversion, which you would have to recalculate your base year expansion data. So typically what it means is when you are doing your GHG inventory, typically at the beginning of setting your methodology, you would have discussed and defined what is the conditions that would trigger recalculations. Number 3, using this software for very expensive for smaller company to use. Those software may be very expensive. Going to this, I imagine that you are relying on software to calculate your emissions level. I guess what Mr. Lee's answer to this is, if you are doing expansion, then it would be more accurate to have this software to calculate for each entities rather than combining them into a single entity. Because again, eventually when you look into verifications, we will still ask the raw data that comes from each entity. So I hope that answers your questions. Oh, we have more new posts. Okay, let's go to Capitan. We have entity where water meter was faulty and we were 3 months with 0 meter water consumption. Can we use average of the year and factor it to become 12-month reading? So for example, average meter reading for 9 months multiplied with 12 months. Okay. Our answer would be, what meter are you using? And this we will assume you are referring to your Scope 3 calculations. So typically, you can just put in the assumption to justify it. It is the same for the fumigations question just now. From Law Tiong Chiu, some context to the previous question. What are the recognized websites to get the conversion factor for the liters to kilowatt per hour or liters to ton of CO2 equivalent? Okay, so for this, we do have that website, and we actually have a discussion of whether we are planning to disclose all this information. But just rest assured, if you are subscribed with us, eventually we will be providing this recording and material to you. And in our material, we will also provide this emission factor, or how do you do this conversion, where are the links associated to this. We have one more new questions. New comments. Well, is it? Oh, the new one. Okay. Okay. From Mr. Law Tiong Chiu again. We are service engineer business. We have service personnel travel to customer site, and we have accurately captured the engineer traveling kilometers. But now we are facing is where to get recognized conversion sector for kilometer to kilowatt per hour or megawatt per hour. So our answer to that is, you don't have to convert it to kilowatt per hour, because kilowatt per hour is referred to electricity. The common emission factor that we use for vehicle transportation is typically using kilometer and convert it into emissions, which is where the emission factors comes in. Again, for where to get this recognized emission factor, we will provide it soon. From Mr. Huang Xingyi, the GHG accounting process looks quite complex. And is this just one portion of the ESG materiality assessment? Typically, how much effort or time would it take for SME to complete this? Our answer to that is, it is a case-by-case situations. 1 full year of data is needed, that's right. If you have not collected any data yet before, then you should at least start by collecting the data collection. So what it means here is, if you haven't started with your data collection, let's say we are now at the end of 2023, and you have not started any collection for year 2023, then you would eventually not be able to come up with a baseline for 2023, unless you would incline to putting in assumption. So the case-by-case situation would be, you don't have a 2023 and you're looking into 2024, then that would take up 1 year time to complete your inventory, because you are taking each monthly data to fit into your inventory. I hope that answers your question. And yes, GHG accounting is only part of emission management in your ESG. From Capitan, my ESG in-house calculator tools, any subscription involved? I see Mr. Lee has responded. No, we don't provide any subscription for the GSG tool. Our tool is basically customized to our projects and clients. So also maybe to answer all your confusion, we as MyESG, we do have services to guide you through GSG inventory. How do you do your reporting? So these are some of the services that we provide. You can opt for 2 days or 3 days. Typically, we are looking at if you have already started your activity data, then so you can opt for 2 days or 3 days depending on your company's availabilities. So I'll leave this slide on so that you can either snapshot, or if you have more questions on our training or what our tools is, you can always contact us on our company line here, or you can drop us an email. So with that, I'm not seeing any other Q&A coming in, also not from the chat box. So I guess I would wrap up this session. And again, I appreciate all your active participations in the chat box. This has been the most interactive from everyone, and thank you for that. So with that, I will end this session by asking you to scan our feedback survey and give us your feedback so that we can improve on our coming webinar that you can subscribe to. So again, thank you everyone, and for those who are celebrating winter solstice, happy winter solstice, and for those who are celebrating Christmas and the upcoming New Year, Merry Christmas and have a Happy New Year, and thank you everyone.